So that's what the law said, and that's what, and really the monarchs tried to enforce this, not always successfully. Now, they had been paying tribute to the Aztecs and to the Incas before the Spaniards came, so there was no real change there. And the system varied a lot from place to place, though. So there were abuses. Isabel died in 1504, and there were 20 years before Charles V really took control of Spain. He had other wars to fight. As you know, Charles V inherited half of Europe, and so he had to travel all around. So it was 20 years before he managed to devote his energies to the Indies, as it was called, to America. And so the colonists took advantage of this during this, from 1504 to 1524, there's a lot of abuses happened there. The Indians are enslaved, they're made to work in the mines, overworked in the mines, and then they begin to bring blacks over to work there because the Indians don't have the stamina to be able to do this. The amazing thing here is that there are protests immediately. The Franciscans who were there, they raised a storm of protest over this. And in 1511, Antonio de Montesinos, who's a Dominican friar, he preached a sermon on the island of Hispaniola, blasting the colonists for their treatment of the Indians. And he went to Spain to complain personally to Charles V. And there was also what's called the Laws of Burgos in 1512, which forbade the mistreatment of the slaves, of the Indians, and the slavery of the Indians. But it fell on deaf ears. You know, it was the governor was supposed to enforce it, but the governor was there, and he had these colonists who had their own guns and had their own, and so they would always put pressure on him not to enforce this or to sort of look the other way while they were doing their thing. So in 1513, you had something called the Laws of Valladolid, which limit the time of work in the mines. It says married women can't work in the mines. Those younger than 14 can't work in mines. Now, that seems rather basic to us, but the first social legislation of this type in France is in 1841, whereas we're talking here about 1513. It's very interesting. Even though it was not implemented very well, the Spanish crown was trying to protect people through a social legislation. In 1514, Bartolomé de las Casas, a Catholic priest and a colonist who had his own encomienda, he was converted to the cause of the Indians. And he quickly became the most vocal defender and the most famous critic of the Spanish administration, defender of the Indians. He's a very controversial figure. He didn't die until 1566. What he ended up doing was, in my mind, he was exaggerating the atrocities that took place. He took things that happened earlier on, and he kept on saying that this was still happening. And, for example, he said that on the island of Hispaniola, the Spaniards had killed 3 million people. Well, that's the island, as with Haiti and Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. And demographers there, they've done their studies, and the pre-Columbian population could not possibly have supported more than 100,000 people. So it was not 3 million people who died. I mean, probably not even 30,000. So he exaggerated for effect in order to make his points, always with a good intention of defending the Indians. So he proposed different solutions to the problems of the Indians. The Indians could be given a chance to live like Spaniards alongside of them as farmers. But that failed because the Indians would not work. They refused to work as farmers. He said the Indians should be won over by peaceful means and evangelization rather than conquest, but that always failed. That was tried, the missionaries were always massacred, so unless the territory was pacified first, then there was no way to preach to them. He said the encomienda system should be abolished and the Indians should be left to govern themselves. But of course, they knew what happened when the Indians governed themselves. You had human sacrifice. They would go back to their barbarism and their pagan religion, that nightmare that was taking place there when Columbus landed. So a lot of the critiques of Las Casas, they're based on a situation prior to 1524 when things started to improve, and he took that and generalized it, and then he made his points using those facts that maybe were no longer true, the facts on the ground. He never learned any Indian language, and all the missionaries were obliged to, in order to preach to the Indians, to learn that language, and he never did. So he was guilty of gross exaggeration, and unfortunately, he is the one, even though he was very well intentioned, he was trying to defend the Indians, he is the one who was most responsible for the Black Legend. Because what happened was that the Protestant historians grabbed on everything that he said, which was grossly exaggerated, and they then started to churn out books and pamphlets and propaganda based on the critiques of Las Casas, which were not true. They were grossly, grossly exaggerated, and yet they were then leapt upon by Protestant historians who said this is a Catholic priest from Latin America who wrote these things. And so that is what made the Black Legend very popular in Protestant countries. So the self-critique is very interesting. And what's amazing, I find, is that the self-criticism that the Spaniards engaged in, and they were constantly re-examining their treatment of the Indians to make sure that it was just. They repeatedly argued over their claim to the New World, and everyone was allowed to express his opinion. There was a great debate, there was freedom of speech, even criticism of the crown was allowed. So she wanted to make sure, and she brought in her moral theologians to make sure that her actions were justified. And they made these laws in order to ensure that the Indians were well treated, even though those laws were very often ignored.